Hey guys, my name is Dana Wygmans and I'm the bass teaching artist with Austin Soundwaves, and today we are going to be learning what is in a bass line. So you're playing the bass and you are one of the most important instruments in the world because you're used in every single genre of music, and you lay not only the harmonic foundation of music, but you also play a really important rhythmic role. And that's why the bass is usually referred to as a rhythm instrument, because you're in the rhythm section. So let's go ahead and get into it a little bit. Now, whether or not you're wanting to just learn some fun bass lines like Seven Nation Army, or you want to play some blues, or some jazz like All Blues, or you just want to make up your own bass lines, might be a good place to get you started. So before we start talking about bass lines, we have to talk about chord progressions. So every song goes through a series of chords. It goes from one chord to the next, and that's called the chord progression. And it's our job to outline those chords. So let's talk about what that means a little bit. And way back when Bach was writing music in the Baroque era of classical music, the bass instruments, which probably wouldn't have been something like what we see today, but it was rather a bass-like instrument called the violone, would be playing something called the basso continuo part, which still outlined the chord progression, but this part was usually written out for us. So it sounded something like this. So in that last example, I was using my bow, which is pretty standard of a lot of classical styles. Today we're actually going to be focusing more on plucked styles, or pitzing, or pizzicato is what we call plucked strings. And we're just going to be focusing on more non-classical music. So continuing on talking about chord progressions. Every song has a chord progression, and a really standard one we're going to listen to right now is the 12-bar blues. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a note every single time the chord changes, just to show you how the chords shift through the song. And the example we're going to be listening to is Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry. Changes here, and again. Once again, and then again. So again, that was a 12-bar blues, and I was playing the root note every single time the chord changed. So what that means is this song was in B flat, and so I was playing a B flat when the guitar player was playing a B flat chord. That is the root of that chord, or the first scale degree of that chord. So the root of B flat is a B flat. When it changed to an E flat chord, I played an E flat. Again, that is the root note. And that's kind of what my job as a bass player is, to outline the chords or the chord progression by playing the root notes. Eventually I'll play more notes than that, but for starters we're just going to focus on roots. So the best thing that you can do for yourself as a bass player is to start learning your scales. We're just focusing on roots today, but I would start practicing your scales. Learn your scales in first position, get familiarized with the notes in first position first, half position, work your way up to the next neck block, and that's going to get you pretty far. Now in a scale, and let's take G major for example. So we play a G major scale, and every note in the scale can be assigned a number. The first note in the scale is 1, that's a G. A is 2, B is 3, C is 4, D is 5, E is 6, F sharp is 7, G is 8, that's the octave. And those are good numbers to know because we're going to be referring to those throughout the video, and as you continue to work on your bass lines, it's good to kind of know what note you're playing in relationship to the chord, in addition to just the root. But let's focus on roots for a second. So the question is, can you play a bass line using just root notes? And the answer is yes, you can definitely do that. For example, the Police do it all the time, so why not? So as long as you're following the chord progression and you're playing the root note when the chord changes, you're totally playing a bass line. And you can play some happening bass lines with just roots. We're going to listen to a couple examples in a second, just using root notes. Now, keep in mind, you still have to be a really active listener. You still have to make sure that when the chord changes, that you change your note as well. So if the chord changes to a G sharp, major chord, you got to play a G sharp. If it changes to an E flat minor chord, play an E flat. And you kind of get the idea. So let's listen to some examples. So the first example we're going to listen to is Every Breath You Take by The Police. And I'm using this example because the bass player only plays root notes, and he also just keeps a steady, constant eighth note pulse the entire time. And as a member of the rhythm section, you've got to keep that pulse going. You've really got to stay steady, even if you're just playing eighth notes, because if you drop that beat, that's not going to be good for the rest of your band. So you have a big responsibility there. So let's listen to this example. We're in A flat, and I'll tell you when I change the chords. You'll see the chords at the bottom of the screen. So I'm playing an A flat right now, F, D flat, E flat, and back to A flat. And it just keeps going. Now, last example we're going to go over is Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and we're going over this example not because the bass player only uses root notes. In fact, if you listen to it, he uses a lot of notes, and it's very cool. But I would argue that the reason the bass line is so cool is because of its rhythmic components. He's creating drive and interest because of his rhythm and his groove, and not necessarily because of his note choices. So I want to use this as an example of how you can just play roots to still achieve that goal. And that brings us to the fact that bass lines are so important rhythmically, and they can really define a genre. In this particular example, playing a lot more offbeats and being a lot more syncopated works really well for R&B and soul music. And what James Jamerson plays originally, like I said, is not just roots. So what he plays is something like this. Or something similar. Now I'm going to play it again, taking out some of those leading tones and some of those extra notes, and just play roots, because I want to show you that you could still create a groovy bass line just following the chord progression and playing roots again. And that would sound something like this. So the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to be just playing some bass lines. I'm just going to make them up using the same chord progression over and over, but I'm going to change the rhythm each time because I want to show you how much the rhythm can change the style of what you play. So we're just going to be going between two different chords. It's going to be the same one each time, and I'm going to be joined by my friend Micah, and let's see what happens. So we're going to be playing 3 different examples, and in every single example we're going to be varying the rhythm. I'm going to be playing over the same progression each time. We're just going to be going between C and G, and again I'm just playing roots, but I'm changing the rhythm. And this is my associate Micah, and he's going to be improvising each time. Ready?
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4. Straight eighth notes, and here's another one a little bit more rhythmic, and here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that time we took out the exact pulse of the eighth note, and we just had this going instead. So this last example that we're going to be using is more of a syncopated, off the beat feel. 1, 2, 3, and some bass lines just using the root, and the next note that you should start adding in is the fifth. And we play roots and fifths and bass lines all the time. That's a very, very classic way to sort of round out your bass line. So what is a fifth? So if we're in G major, for example, the scale we used before, the fifth is exactly 5 notes up from G, or what we call perfect fifth. So in G, we have G, A, B, C, D. D is the fifth of G. Now let's say we go to an E chord, an E minor chord. Then let's figure out fifth for that. So we have E, F sharp, G, A, B would be the fifth. Okay, so if we went between those chords, G, D, G, D, E, B. And that was me playing roots and fifths between those. So the genres we're going to be exploring for just playing roots and fifths are bluegrass and Latin, because we play roots and fifths in those all the time. But what I want you to keep in mind is that the rhythm is very different in each of these genres. And in bluegrass, we keep more of a standard pulse like this. But in Latin music, we do something more like this. So bluegrass is more right on beats 1 and 3, whereas Latin is more syncopated. We have that dotted chord note, 8th note feel. So rhythm is very, very important to sort of dictate the style. Now, a great song to start practicing your roots and fifths is actually My Girl, because a bass player just plays roots and fifths the whole time. And we're in C major for this. The only other chord we're going to go to in the beginning is an F chord. So the fifth of C is a G, and then the fifth of F is, think about it, it's a C. So let's give this one a try. So we're still in C. We're about to go to F. Ready? F. And back to C. C. F. C. So practice that one to kind of get your foot in the door with roots and fifths, and let's take a look at some bluegrass and Latin examples. So our first example that you're going to be hearing is a bluegrass tune called Pig in a Pen, and it's just 3 chords. We're going to be going between a D chord, a G chord, and an A chord. They're all major chords. So we just need to know the fifth of those notes. So when we play the D chord, then we need to know the root, which is D, and the fifth, which is A. So I'm going to be playing between D and A. Now when I get to the G chord, I go to the root on the downbeat, and then the third beat, I play the fifth of G, which is D. Then I return to the D major, keep playing Ds and As. When I get to the A chord, I play the root and the fifth of A, which is E. And that completes our bass line for that. So in bluegrass, it's pretty standard, just play on beats 1 and 3, and we keep those beats steady. And you can add a little bit of a slap in between, and that's stylistic for that genre. 1, 2, 3, 4. I keep on the pen, on feeling all on me. It's really girl, feeling when I'm gone. Our last example is Girl from Ipanema, and this is a Latin tune. Specifically, it is a bossa nova. And you're going to be hearing me still playing roots and fifths over the chord progression, but I'm going to be using very specific rhythm, and this is a really standard rhythm to use in your bass lines when playing Latin music. And it's going to sound something like this. And you're going to hear me using that rhythm throughout, no matter what chord I change to, which is essentially a dotted chord note with anything. So for this one, again, I'm just using roots and fifths, so as you follow along the chord progression at the bottom, try to think of those fifths in your head. I'll give you the first one, F major 7 chord, the fifth is a C. Okay? Mm-hmm. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you've mastered your roots and fifths, and you can start adding in more notes. A great one to adding in is the third and the fourth. Some classic bass lines you can play with those notes are, right? Another one bites the dust. Third, fourth, in E minor, and that's how they create that bass line. The third of E is G, the fourth of E is A. Another good one is Come Together by the Beatles. He just adds the third in there to kind of get that distinct sound. Because we're in D minor, he adds in the F. That's the third. Another good one that uses thirds and fourth is Green Onions. And we're in F for this one. And this is another blues scale. So again, I'm just adding the third and the fourth of F here. So the third would be A flat, fourth would be B flat. We're in F minor. Right? Same thing when I change the chord. And you get the idea. So after that, a great note to start adding in is the seventh. Now the seventh is awesome because you can really make the your lines lead into the next chord as the progression happens here, and that's really helpful for your bandmates because they can really hear how the progression changes as they're playing or if they're soloing. So classic bass lines that use the seventh are, right? Stand by me. After that, I would say start adding in sixths. So if you got sixths and sevenths in there, then you can play a classic blues bass line, something like this, which adds the sixth and the seventh. And you can do it each time the chord changes. So sixth and seventh of G, G is the root, right? And E would be the sixth, and F would be the seventh. In this case, it's a lowered seventh. And now after that, after you've been practicing your scales, you are ready to start walking a bass line. Walking a bass line is so much fun, and it's a great way to use all the notes in the scale as you go through progression. We use it a lot in jazz and swing music. But what I would encourage you to do in order to start learning how to walk a bass line, that's kind of a class all on its own, is to start listening a lot. Start listening to bass players who do it really well. Start transcribing or writing out what you hear, and practice your scales. Practice your scales so much. And when you're writing out your own walking lines, focus on one, making sure that your root notes land when the chord changes. And then start working in some leading tones or those sevenths to kind of lead in from one chord to the next. That helps soloists or your other bandmates really hear how the chords change. And then fill in the rest of the notes from there, picking and choosing which note you think is going to be coolest. So start working on some walking lines, and then eventually, hopefully, you can do something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So after you have experimented playing some bass lines with all sorts of different notes, then I would recommend just start learning some cool riffs. One of my favorite ones to learn is So What, which has a great bass part. And other of your favorites. So once you're ready to start playing bass lines, I really, really encourage you to keep listening to your favorite stuff, but just make sure that you keep playing roots when the chord changes. That's really important. And that's kind of our job. Start adding in fifths, and then start exploring the rest of the notes. Work on creating your own walking lines, and then experiment with rhythm. Make sure that you really listen to music that you want to play, or start creating your own genre and start experimenting with different rhythms to really capture a style that you're trying to go for. See how the rhythm affects it. And I hope that you guys have learned something today and that you've enjoyed this presentation. So keep playing music, keep listening to music, and keep learning about music. And I hope that you start creating some bass lines.
So another question here is, do I have some favorite bass lines from popular music? I do. Some of the bass lines I showed in the video were bass lines that I enjoy, like the Beatles Come Together bass line. That bass line's sweet. And it's really not that complicated. And I think that that's kind of what I wanted to portray in the video, was that a lot of really cool bass lines aren't actually that complicated. Obviously, there's a lot of examples of like super complex bass lines that are equally as awesome. Some other favorite bass lines, I actually didn't show this one in the video, but the bass line from Pink Floyd's Money, I think, is really cool. It's in 7. It's like do 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 do. That's a cool bass line. Honestly, I think that other really cool bass lines, you know, I have some favorites in like jazz. Footprints has a really standard, the Wayne Shorter tune, really standard bass line that you play. I love that tune. And like I said, So What's got a great bass line. Maybe that doesn't count as popular music. Other popular music, like a lot of like Motown music has tons of great bass lines. I mean, I play that Ain't No Mountain High Enough song. I mean, My Girl is jamming, and it's just roots and fifths. So other favorites, man, I'll think of them. I'll think of more. But yeah, I think that all those are really good ones. All right, another question is, can I talk about instances where a technically wrong bass note can totally work? Yeah. So in jazz, sometimes we do a thing called a tritone substitution, which a lot of times, so a tritone is the lowered fifth or the raised fourth of a root note. So like if we're in G, and normally you'd go to like a D for the fifth, and you played a D flat instead, that would be the tritone. And from a classical point of view, that's kind of a wrong note. You don't want to put the tritone in there because that's an incredibly dissonant sound. It's the most dissonant sound. But in jazz, we use that a lot. We do tritone substitutions. And if your band is following you and they also play the chord built on the tritone instead, that can be a cool way to change things up. So that would be a good example. And then another thing too is when we walk bass lines, and I didn't get to talk about this a lot in the video, you can play chromatic notes that don't necessarily fit in the scale. I wouldn't play it on like the downbeat or anything, but as we're walking through the line, and especially as we lead into another chord, you can sometimes alter and notes and make chromatic tones and make chromatic leading tones to kind of finagle your way into the next chord. And actually, I think it sounds really cool that way, and it's really easy to hear the flow of the bass line that way. If you're only sticking to notes strictly within the scale, sometimes it can be, you know, you can still do it. It doesn't quite have that leading quality to it. Another question was, who is on my Mount Rushmore of bass players? So that's a great question. I mean, I'm trying. I have a, you know, I know a lot of really great classical musicians, classical bassists. Obviously, like Edgar Meyer is amazing. Gary Carr is an incredible bass player. He's another classical musician. And if we're talking about like non-classical stuff, I mean, James Jamerson is awesome. He was the bass player in Ain't No Mountain High Enough, which I showed in the video. He's incredible. And then, you know, Victor Wooten, amazing. And Thundercat is super cool. I think he's an awesome musician. So I would recommend listening to him as well. And as far as jazz, I mean, there's a million amazing jazz musicians. I love Charles Mingus. I really, really like Sam Jones. Christian McBride, incredible bass player. Rufus Reed, all those guys. All right, other questions. Why did I choose the bass over other instruments? That's a funny story. I actually started, so I took piano lessons when I was a kid, and I didn't really take to it. I really wish I had stuck with it, but I wasn't good at practicing it. So I started playing the violin in middle school, and I was really excited about it. I actually come from like a band family. Nobody had really played string instruments before, but man, I don't know. I didn't like the way the violin sounded near my face, and it didn't feel natural to me. And to be honest, I wanted to switch to the bass just because I thought bass players looked cool. So it was kind of a shallow reason. But then once I started playing it, I don't know, I just really took to it, and it felt very natural to me. I really think that everybody has an instrument that feels good to play, and it just makes sense, and it just works. And now that I play the bass, I mean, it's an incredibly versatile instrument. Nothing feels better to me than playing the bass. And when I don't get to play it for a little while, or like right now when I can't really gig it, I just miss touching it. I miss playing it and plucking the strings and doing all that stuff. So, I love being the foundation part of music. I kind of like being in that background role and just sort of grooving with the rest of the band. So playing bass is great, man. Have I played Goodbye Pork Pie by Mingus? I have not played that tune, but I love Mingus, so I will definitely look that up now. Thank you for the suggestion. And I'm just looking for other questions here. What is my dream gig? That's a good question. I don't know if I could assign it a genre, to be honest, because I enjoy playing so many different genres. I think my dream gig is maybe a band where I can just lay out a bass line that I'm feeling, and they just like run with it, and they just take it. Because when I think of music, to be honest, I understand chord progressions and things like that, but I don't always think of things chordally when I'm writing. I just sort of play bass lines. And I think of melodies and stuff, but man, if I could just like have a guitar player or a keyboard player while I'm just laying out a bass line to just take it and make up those chords and complete them, that would be amazing. So I think that bass lines kind of come out of me organically. If I'm playing in a style, then I'll fit to that style. But when I make them myself, it's just kind of whatever comes out of my brain is what comes out of my fingers. So yeah, so just to have my own band where I can just play bass lines and they just kind of complete the rest, that would be awesome. Talk about the relationship of bass and percussion in jazz as far as the bottom goes. So the bass, like I was saying in the video, is a rhythmic instrument. You got to keep a steady pulse. Now in jazz, like if you're playing swing, you've got to fit into the ride beat that the drummer lays down, and that has to lock in. And if that foundation isn't there, then it can make it really, really hard for the rest of the band to kind of jam on top of that. In fact, I've been in like teaching situations in which the rest of the band, like the horn instruments, in this case it was strings, they kind of had the melody, but something wasn't jiving between the drummer and the bassist, and it was totally a weird cacophony of sound. So you've got to get the rhythm or the groove or the beat fit in together between the drummer and the bass, and that has to be locked in together. And then, like if you're playing Latin music or bossa nova music or samba music, if you have just a drummer, then they'll lay out a different kind of beat pattern. But if you have somebody playing like congas or something like that, or claves, that's a really, really important one. The clave rhythm in Latin music is is very specific, and your bass line kind of has to lay into that. So as a bass player, you've got to listen to the percussionist. It's super important, and they have to listen to you too. So have I gigged with any cool musician celebs? I mean, maybe like Austin celebs. I wish I could say that I've gigged with more famous people. Maybe someday. But definitely some really cool people in Austin that I love and respect a lot. So So if there aren't any other questions, I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for watching today. I was really excited to put this together. Obviously, I mean, I can talk about bass lines for hours. I wish that I could have, had like an hour-long show about talking about bass lines. I could have explored more. But if you're interested in learning bass lines, definitely keep listening to stuff. Transcribe bass lines, listen to jazz, listen to classical, listen to R&B, listen to Latin, listen to classic rock, listen to all the stuff, and get yourself a bass, start playing some bass lines. All right, cool. So, hope you guys learned something today. Thank you for joining. Bye.